Um, that leads me to our benefactor for the day, and let me pass this one on to you because they're good guys.
I'm Catfish with Angry Audio. We have a new product. We call it the Headphone Disconnector. This is it. It's got a headphone plug on one side, so you can plug this into your mixing console or your headphone amplifier. And then it's got a jack on the other side, and you're going to plug your headphone cable into this. This connector in the middle is actually a magnetic connector that will separate in the event that you apply some force. So this is $29, by the way, and it's available from broadcast resellers and such as Broadcasters General Store, SCMS. Choose your favorite broadcast reseller. Call them, tell them that you want the Angry Audio headphone disconnector, and they'll fix you up.
Well, thank you, Catfish. Appreciate that.
I'm Catfish with Angry Audio. We have a new product.
Oh, he's
we
back
call it
again.
The Headphone Disconnector.
I guess what happens is if you don't stop it, it recycles. Okay. That said, I am
You
really
missed the 1 kilohertz Q tone.
Thank you, Harold. That works. I'm really happy to have David Peabody with us today from Broadcast Signal Labs up in Massachusetts. And David is kind of an expert and going to talk to us about RF safety. And I look forward to this. I've got questions. You may have questions. David, let us know what we need to know.
I'll give it a shot. First of all, by way of introduction, I spent 40 years working for Broadcast Signal Lab, and when the owner passed away, I decided to continue his good work. So I'm now the owner and proprietor, and Rick Levy, God bless him, has gone to another broadcast level. He's speaking from God's platform these days. I have basically 50 years, if you take all the various and sundry events in my life, experience in broadcasting, and in particular RF safety, for much of the last 35 years, both in writing and in testing sites and assuring that they're right. By way of information, the RF safety, the origins of our understanding of radiation and hazards and safety began with the dawn of the nuclear age. The hazards were recognized due to exposures in labs and the handling of nuclear material in the budding X-ray industry, and the first atomic bomb test at Alamogordo in New Mexico. All of these involved ionizing radiation. We, in the RF safety field in broadcasting, deal largely with non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is everything from X-ray up through gamma, all of the higher frequency products. And we start out our understanding of ionizing radiation starts out in the light area and working its way down the spectrum through microwave radio and on down into extremely low frequency. The hazards of non-ionizing radiation, we first became aware of it with naval shipboard operators. They would post, they would basically paint all of their equipment had the waveguide coming up into a phosphor screen. They would stare into it and analyze the data there. And the problem was they were taking a dose right to their eyeballs and their head almost constantly. So by the early 1950s or late 40s, they had a body of people who were either, in the service or no longer in the service, who were coming down with very odd cancers. And the Navy, while they've never recognized this, as a source of injury. They allow a form that if you file with the VA, you can list non-ionizing radiation as a potential cause. But shipboard operators would literally sit in harbor and illuminate the boat next to them, and to show it off. Look at this neat technology. What they were doing was taking a heavy bath to their eyeballs and to their brain. By the 1950s, the military was extending through the private sector. Limits to radiation exposure of all kinds began to develop. The initial standards involved measuring the heat effect on a block of agar that approximated the content of water and salt of a human being, water, salt, and solids. And they would measure a heating threshold. So that sort of became the initial point at which they were determining how they would moderate exposures to the RF energy. The standards would be tested and revised several times in 1960, 66, and 74, and finally landing on a new standard in 1981. This is the standard that is in use today. It is a standard derived from a more careful look at the specific absorption rates of the human body as opposed to exposure and at different frequencies. It's interesting, if you note, the Russians arrived at roughly the same standard at the same time and then cut it by a factor of 10. So they could claim, I guess, Cold War bragging that they were more safe than the Americans. Of course, safety is a matter of application and attentiveness, and not a matter of being able to have bragging rights. So our limits, the ones we have arrived on today, are for controlling exposures. The FCC and the IEEE have written extensively on what constitutes exposure control. And depending on the measures, sometimes predicted RF levels the controls can be everything from notice to simply telling a person that an RF is present, all the way to physical barriers, locked doors, and prohibitions from entering. But first, we have to look at why we test and what we want to protect the public. We want to protect ourselves and our employees, and we want to protect visitors to our sites. We also want to demonstrate compliance and avoid FCC fines and civil liability. The last point is for some the most important reason to have your sites evaluated for radio frequency energy exposure. The fines and civil liability. The FCC has little tolerance for stations that expose the public to risk, and unevaluated broadcaster emitters have a scant ability to refuse or refute RF exposure violations or civil claims. One of the famous cases is Mount Wilson, the notice of apparent liability for forfeiture. Four broadcasters at the site were fined $10,000 each for violating Section 11320 of the Commission's rules. The site's in the San Gabriel Mountains. It's heavily traveled with tourism and hikers. There's a road to the top. There's an astronomical observatory up there, which draws a lot of people. And there's even a post office where you can get your hiking book stamped, or send your friends cards from Mount Wilson. The FCC was making an effort to identify what combination of four FM broadcasters was causing an out of tolerance circumstance outside the fence of the broadcast compound. And basically it exceeded the general population uncontrolled maximum permissible exposure limit by almost 60%. In addition, the FCC also found unlocked gates to the occupational exposure areas. In other words, gates to the compound of the broadcast facility were unlocked and left open. There is a photo, and I can't find it online, but I remember seeing it 20 years ago, of the sign and a bunch of chain with weeds growing through them. So ultimately, when the FCC ran into a little bit of trouble with the stations cooperating with the effort, and they appeared up on the mountain 2 days in a row, July 11th and 12th, they were able to say then that not only were the violations willful, they were repeated. And that was the basis for their fines. Had everybody cooperated, there may not have been fines, but the FCC doesn't like non-cooperation on RF issues. I can't express strongly enough, though, that there is a particular point of law that says you are jointly and severally responsible at every site. If you're a sole owner and you've got one station, you're responsible for the site. But if you're there with 5 other broadcasters or 2 other broadcasters and a cell operator, it does not matter to the FCC. They'll determine who's producing the signal, perhaps, that is causing the out of tolerance condition for public exposure. But they're going to fine everybody because they want everybody at a site involved in RF safety, especially when it comes to public exposure, which is, by the way, the only thing that's on your application about RF is public exposure. So after several years of wrangling, the Mount Wilson decision was upheld. And again, jointly and severally means something in law and in responsibility in these circumstances. So when we talk about evaluating RF safety, you're left with a question. How much do I know? How much knowledge can I amass? Can I do this job competently? And generally speaking, of course, it's my business, but I generally recommend people at least consult with an RF safety person, because professional, because we're well reversed in the intent and the implementation of exposure controls, and such a professional will be able to evaluate not only radio frequency energy that's detectable for levels measured in a milliwatts per centimeter squared, but they also tend to have calibrated equipment, whereas the old dusty box that's been sitting in the corner for 8 years and you bring it out and use it once and then put it back in the old dusty box. RF safety engineers will map your site. They will show you all of the areas where the public limit is exceeded and the areas where the occupational limit is exceeded, and what areas you need to either modify access to, fence off, or simply put up signs. Generally speaking, a good evaluation will come with a written report, and that report will include maps and mitigation processes that are necessary. Frequently at shared sites, good neighborly broadcasters will work together with one RF professional. They'll come up with a unified report, which of course can be tailored to each station by the professional if asked for. But in so doing, everybody knows what's gone on at their site and whether or not they're in a good condition relative to both public exposure and occupational exposure, because as somebody who's been doing this for a while, when the needle pegs, I back up. I have no interest in being cooked in any form. I've heard the horror stories from fellow broadcasters about sitting in microwave trucks and wondering why they were sweating, only to find out that the access panel to the HF box in the back of the truck was left off by the last person who serviced it. That's a pretty shocking idea if you think about it. You know, somebody sitting inside of an aluminum box cooking. Infrequently, BSL, Broadcast Signal Lab, has been engaged to map entire mountain sites. We've done several. And in that case, we're mapping it for, again, for public exposure and occupational, but also usually to assure everyone at the site what the problems are and that they're attended to and taken care of. Another advantage to having a professional examination is that sometimes civilians become aware of RF safety issue. They see a story on the news, or they see something on you know, not to knock PBS, but PBS, or they just see something on the internet that gets them all worked up, and they run out and they buy a little RF meter and they run around mountaintops. About 30 years ago, my company evaluated a brand new installation in Pelham, Massachusetts, where the University of Massachusetts had just put on a new, more powerful antenna and radio transmitter. And the antenna was located in the configuration that it, on its way out to Pioneer Valley, illuminated one set of guy wires. Well, those guy wires were hot all the way to the ground. And the mitigation for that was that, you know, that day we went down to local Home Depot or whatever the store was, bought slat wood and rubber fencing, and we put the rubber fencing over the slat wood, and we made it impossible to get near those wires. And I understand it, about a year and a half later, they replaced the top section with a non-conductive. And in that manner, with 20 feet of non-conductive guy line up there, the problem went away and never came back. But that was all predicated because a professor at the University of Massachusetts, who liked to hike up on that mountain, said, no, this is, you can't go to higher power. This is dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And indeed, unfortunately, he turned out to be a little bit correct. So we mitigated that problem. So who should evaluate for RF? Who should have an RF evaluation? Basically all new sites and all multiple emitter sites. Although in some cases, single emitter sites like an AM, you can use the FCC formula, and that formula has an awful lot of leeway in it. So when you put your fences 5 meters out and they're only required to be 3 meters out at your frequency and your power, you've covered yourself very well. And in those circumstances, maybe an RF evaluation is not necessary, but in most other cases it is. When you do when should you do an RF evaluation? When the site is first completed, when modifications are made, periodically to ensure nothing has changed, as an annual standard for some states. Some states require annual measurement, and whenever the regulatory standards change that would affect what you've already measured or what you believe to be your situation. In evaluating RF, facility managers and broadcasters need to deal with the site on 2 levels. The one level is the public exposure, any areas of concern, any locations, including locations that might involve trespassing, where the general public could just walk up and walk around your facility. Now, I'm not talking about climbing over the barbed wire fence, but if you put a sign at the end of the road says no trespass, yeah, people tend to walk past that. The second area to evaluate is for occupational exposure, and that concerns any employee, contract jobber, invited guest, or yourself who might have access to the site. That's usually inside the fence. The standard used to evaluate RF exposure is a measurement of power density that has been scaled into a percentage by the American National Standards Institute, and it is called the Radio Frequency Protection Guide. And put simply, the general public maximum permissible exposure limit is 20%, and the occupational maximum permissible exposure limit, MPE, is 100% of RFPG. Evaluating exposures when placing signs to control your site, the first consideration is, do your signs and do your fences keep the public below 20%? Remember Mount Wilson, the problem was outside of the perimeter fence of the compound. They were at 30% plus of the RFPG, and thereby more 60% over. So let's make it 32%, 60% over the public limit. The actual number was 60.5%. If fences are adequate, and the answer is yes, if you've got your fences located to keep people out of areas where the RF exceeds 20%, then you move on to concern yourself with occupational exposure. And I know I'm sort of boring everybody a little bit, but the next section I'm going to read it verbatim because it's kind of technical, and in the case of the FCC, meaning and divining the meaning and meaning of words are important. So pardon my my verbosity. Guidance in dealing with both general population uncontrolled exposure and occupational controlled exposure can be found in the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology Bulletin number 65. Under OET 65, there are many methods of controlling exposure. There is no preference given to any particular means of compliance in any given situation. It is determined by the effectiveness of that method at a given site. Simple barriers such as fencing, posting, or locking out unauthorized persons are acknowledged as sufficient in most cases to prevent exposure levels from exceeding the federal general population uncontrolled exposure limit. In occupational controlled exposure areas where exposure levels may exceed the occupational limit of 100% of RFPG, controlling exposure may consist of all of the following: simple postings, keep back signs, fences, non-conductive physical barriers, additional fencing or barriers inside the compound to protect your workers, individual training, or while work is being performed in those areas, supervision, the lowering of transmitter power, the use of protecting clothing, and shutting off the transmitter with a lockout tagout. Planning to avoid exposure is probably beyond the maximum permissible exposure level, may also include limiting the actual time spent in a restricted area for an acceptable time average exposure. The rule of thumb is 100%, 6 minutes. And that's, I would personally, I cut that by a great margin. I say 100% for no minutes, but that's my personal preference. Any area where the individual may be exposed in excess of the general population uncontrolled exposure limit must be designated as a restricted area and accessible only to workers who are aware of and can exercise control over their exposure. Even persons who are transient visitors to these locations, such as electricians, painters, landscapers, could be anyone who could be allowed access under the occupational controlled exposure criteria. They must be made aware of their exposure and exercise control over their exposure. Again, several methods: supervision, or they're in charge. But as far as going over 100%, the simplest barrier is a physical barrier and a lock and a key. Again, to reiterate, persons exposed as a consequence of their employment to energy levels that are above the public limit must be fully aware of and exercise control over their exposure. So that brings us to what? It brings us to signs. When you have an area already fenced off and you've got keys and locks, and you still have to tell people what the potential hazards beyond each barrier are. And that brings us to the first thing is, when you put up a fence, you put up no trespassing signs. Well, no trespassing signs cover you in terms of allowing police action against trespassers. And in some states, they have to be placed every 50 feet apart along the perimeter of your fence, which gives you legal fallback on trespassers, but it doesn't really help you in terms of conveying any useful information about the RF at the site. Some broadcasters elect to scare people off with big scary signs that say things like warning, danger, high voltage, danger of electrocution, we'll arrest you. And these are all effective along a perimeter, but they may not be useful to personnel within the perimeter. So RF safety professionals are not pushing signs for profit per se. The fact is that appropriate signs protect both visitors and broadcasters and the site owner. The problem with RF energy is that it's unseen. Creating an environment that builds awareness and imparts useful information differs at every site. When addressing signs, the current thinking within the RF safety industry derives from years of trial and sadly some errors. A series of control levels, or the envelope method, if you will, was put forth at an NAB conference by a former owner of Broadcast Signal Lab, Mr. David Maxon, in 2004. And what his proposal did was it aligned RF sign usage with OSHA standards as to color and level of threat implementation. So the levels of signage became blue for notice, yellow for caution, orange for warning, and red for danger or imminent risk. The blue notice signs appropriately inform the general public that in that area there is RF energy present. And that's usually sufficient. You don't have to go beyond that point. Just tell them, and that combined with a no trespassing sign and a fence should be enough to keep people up. Moving inward, at the point of a locked door, you come into areas where the energy may now be it's above the public limit, and it now may be exceeding the occupational limit. At that point, if you're outside, if you're at the door, a caution sign is in order, because that gives people notice that beyond this door. If, however, there are imminent hazards right behind that door, you might want to put up an orange warning sign and to be followed inside close to whatever the offending implement is, whether it's a coaxial switch or a power divider. You want to put up on that device or immediately in front of it a red RF warning sign. So that's the layering. As you move inward, things get a little more important, and everything inside a layer of an envelope that requires proactive control, the controls can either be passive or active, as I said, fences or locked barriers. Yellow signs are intended to inform and raise awareness for persons entering an area that RF levels may exceed the occupational limit. It's generally okay to work in these areas, but more alerts may be forthcoming as you move further into a site. For instance, when you enter a gate for a fence compound with an ATU, the gate may just require a caution sign, or it may require a warning sign. The ATU door may require a red RF hazard sign, actually telling you that there's risk of electrocution or being over the public limit. And if you stand there long enough, you're going to take an RF bath, and nobody wants an RF bath. You don't come out feeling squeaky clean. Let's see, I'm moving forward in my own notes here. Yeah, the issue with red warning signs is that's wherever there's an imminent warning of death or serious injury. RF burns, overexposure, electrocution, and depending on where the instance is, that determines where you put the sign. An engineer that I know, and on the score of what can happen if you don't do it right, an engineer that I know who was working on his own antenna on Mount Greylock lost his sight in one eye because the microwave transmitter that was on the same tower was not locked out when he climbed to work on his antenna. And he took a bath to one eye, and the optic nerve died, and that was it for sight for him. Let's see, what else do I have here before I wrap up? Oh, mitigation in a site is tailored particularly to the site. In one case, we had a guy wire landing in a farmer's field, and the guy wanted to hay the field and didn't care that the guy wire was landing in the middle of his field, and wanted us to occupy as little area as possible with our preventative measures. So we took 3 plastic barrels, strapped them together, chained them to the base of the guy wire, put a sign up, says, caution, beyond this point, levels exceed the public limit, and we went on about our business. The site manager was happy, the local farmer was happy, and injury was prevented. Not that anybody would ever sit and lean up against a set of guy wires, but because we can't predict people's behavior, we have to act accordingly. Let's see if I got a couple more things here. Oh, on a multi-emitter site. Frequently multi-emitter sites, because it's radio waves and radio waves interact, you can always conceive of 2 waves crashing into each other on a lake, and the peaks in the middle are higher. RF to some degree behaves very similar to that. And when you're doing a site, you frequently find peaks and valleys, nodes of high area and lower area. And when surveying large sites, we tend to work outside the fence as well, out to a distance, because multiple emitters can tend to work together. And we have found locations outside of fences, like Mount Wilson, where mitigation was required. In one case, the broadcaster involved, when we finally identified who was contributing the most to that circumstance, simply moved his antennas up a little, and that was the end of it. He filed a modification with the FCC, and there was no more problem down on the ground on the hiking trail on that mountaintop. So with that, I'm going to go quiet on you. I am going to send Barry things that he can post up after this meeting and put for your perusal, but examples of signs and so forth. But generally, I'm going to add one more thing. Generally, signs have three components. One is whatever is the appropriate symbol for what you're talking about. So in the case of RF energy, there's a specific symbol that is recognized for RF energy. It's a tower configuration with waves moving out from the center. And that's one component. The second component is the sign background has a color. The color being, as I said, blue, yellow, orange, or red. And then, so you have the word caution, the logo, and then important information. And the important information should include not only what is the problem, but what is the mitigation for that problem. So for instance, beyond this point, RF levels exceed the occupational limit. Stay back blank number of feet. So that pretty much covers my general knowledge base on the subject. I turn it over to you, Barry, and open the floor for questions.
All right. Thank you, David. First of all, I think this is the documentation that you want everybody to at least become partially familiar with. And the URL is right there. I put it on it for you. It's on the FCC site.
Thank you, Barry.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions and then we'll toss it to everybody else. First of all, the difference in frequency versus the power. As many of us know, or we think we know, FM radiation is probably the most dangerous to the human body because of the wavelength. But what about high power microwave? What about AM? Where do these fit into the range of danger?
Well, if you're working off of the ANSI RFPG scale in measurement, the scale is designed to accommodate the differences in frequencies. So the specific absorption rate was tested at various frequencies to determine where the 100% lands. It does change in terms of milliwatts per centimeter squared, in part because the wavelength has changed. But for the most part, if you're testing and you're at 100% or above, that is considered an occupational hazard area, and you just don't go there, don't work there, unless you have some way to mitigate the circumstance, like perhaps wearing a RF safety suit, which a lot of tower climbers do as a matter of course, even if they know the tower is going to be, the emitters are going to be shut off.
But in general, we have people that worked at 50 kilowatt stations for years, decades,
Yep.
and did not report any problems. And yet here we just now, you mentioned tower climbers with safety suits, primarily for FM, and there is a tremendous pressure to turn an FM off, use an auxiliary site, television as well.
Yep, FM and television, yep.
How does microwave balance into this?
Well, microwave is, think about it. I mean, microwave, the frequency, you could, microwaves, if you, well.
Okay, you don't want to look into a microwave dish. I know that.
Exactly. Microwaves can cook food. So, and not just microwaves that are on the frequency of the one in your kitchen. And generally speaking, you don't want to be in the line of fire of a microwave. But again, the scale that ANSI came up with, the radio frequency prediction guide, is modified to handle that prediction.
But in general, you're going to tell me that a lower power at microwave is more dangerous than FM.
define, okay, not to be argumentative, but I must say define danger. Because
Okay, maybe 100 watts at a microwave frequency as opposed to 6 kilowatts at FM.
it depends on where you are relative to that signal.
Okay.
I don't mean to, I don't mean to be argumentative. It's any microwave beyond 40 watts can be dangerous.
There you go. That's what I wanted to ask.
Any microwave beyond 40 watts can be dangerous. So your kitchen microwave may run at 1,000 watts or 1,200 watts. That's why they put a wire screen in the door. There's a new form of cooking that involves light energy, and that door is completely opaque and it's all metal. The point is when you begin to talk RF, you begin to talk shielding, or distance, or both. Those are your protections: shielding or distance, or both. And of course, as you all know, half the distance, double the distance, half the power. So if you're walking backwards away from something, every time you double the distance you are away from something, you've lowered your risk by 1/2. But again, the objective of RF safety is to not be in the zones where it exceeds the occupational limit.
Yeah, great. Okay,
Had a comment, Barry?
sure.
So yeah, I think the key thing there on frequency is they're dealing with the specific absorption rate, and
Yes.
any sort of radiation, whether it's light or radio or whatever, when it encounters a substance, some of that radiation is reflected, some is transmitted through, and some
Yep.
is absorbed. So what
Yep.
they're looking at here is what is absorbed, and it does vary by frequency.
Specific absorption rate varies according frequency, yes. And the ANSI, the American National Standards Institute's radio frequency protection guide system, converts microwatts per centimeter squared onto a scale of percentage, from 0 to 100, but most meters go well beyond that. The meters that I use go to 300% of RFPG. Now, the manufacturer will tell you that above 150%, the number that you're getting off that meter may not be accurate, because you begin to get in areas where you're swamping the meter and you're exceeding its ability to process what's coming at it.
You mentioned earlier that early stuff was based on the thermal effects, and is that still just the case, that it's
No.
only thermal effects? I think I
Oh,
remember reading about some DNA changes in other countries.
Well, in other countries, there is research into, the Finns have done research as has the Belgian army, have done, that talk about chromosomal effect of RF. And in almost every case, well, let's back up a full step. Every single exposure to non-ionizing energy has an effect. The sun can do everything from give you a sunburn to dry you out to a corpse that's just a husk in the desert with skin on it and bone, but no liquid of any kind. So every form of energy has an effect. Studies that have shown chromosomal changes. Again, I'm not a health expert, I'm a safety expert. But studies that have shown chromosomal changes only give you more reason to be careful with RF and not less. Can I say that you're safe in an RF environment? Well, I've known people who've worked at transmitter sites for decades, as Barry said, with no ill effect. Frankly, placing this little gizmo right next to your head for an hour at a time gives your brain a real significant dose. That's why a lot of people have opted to go to Bluetooth headsets, which are far smaller amounts of RF banging away right next to your head. And remember, when you're talking on your cell phone, the further you are from that tower, the amplifier and the transmitter in this thing goes up to match the distance. So the further away you are from a tower, the more you're getting out of your cell phone at your brain.
David,
Yes.
earlier this year, late last year, the FCC released new rules
Mhm.
about RF exposure. And the question was raised how these affect us in broadcast. Are there any practical differences from existing RF site safety plans?
In terms of broadcasters, all they really did was say, basically, we're going to lean a little bit more on controls at sites. In terms of ham radio operators, and that's where most of that was directed, the ham radio operators in this country were basically told that they're going to have to make themselves knowledgeable of what is occurring at their own site in terms of public exposure and occupational exposure. The guidance on it to the ham operators was less than a bright line. FCC 19-126 has some rather amorphous, it's not determinate. It's not you must do this. As far as broadcasters go, OET 65 has been pretty clear. It's been more of an implementation problem by broadcasters than OET 65 being lacking. They allow for different kinds of controls, but at the end of the day, if you read through how you're controlling it and think about it, a physical limitation for entrance to a site is the best control. It's the only control that you can say with reasonable circumstance works. Now, in the case of ham operators, there's an ongoing discussion right now of what constitutes a transient visitor, like the neighbor kid chasing his ball into your yard. There's also some discussion amongst hams. Well, if my ham shack has a window and I can see my antenna, I can shut the power off. Well, yes and no. So, if you're not looking up at that moment, if you're intent upon a scope somewhere, you may not be looking up and see the kid running into your backyard with the ball. A couple mitigations for that would be raise your antenna up another 5 feet if you can. There are available on the commercial market. Amazon has a bunch of handheld meters that, while I wouldn't stake my career on them, some of them are fairly accurate. But the fact is, they basically want to bring hams into compliance with OET 65 in terms of exposure, both occupational and public.
ARRL has a calculator for
Yep.
that, and I happen to have that up on my screen if anybody's interested in share. If I could share it.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'd love to look at that. Who's got it up?
Let me figure out how to share here.
I had the same problem.
Okay, you see it?
Yep, I've seen
So
that.
here I'm saying I'm putting 1,000 watts running radio teletype. And transmit for 5 minutes, receive for 10. Antenna gain, this is a quarter wave vertical 1.5 dBi, 20 meter band. There's the maximum allowed power density down here in milliwatts per square centimeter. And then minimum safe distance for controlled. So that would be for me. And then minimum safe distance for uncontrolled. So that would be the public.
Yep. And that's a very handy calculator. And if to go back to the FCC for a moment, Form 303 has a worksheet on it for broadcasters. Worksheet 1 and worksheet 1A and worksheet 2. They do the same thing, only you do the hand calculation. So yeah, there are tools out there to determine safe distances. And as I said, in the case of the FCC, if you use their calculator, you are well above this. Your safety limit is when you put the fence up at where it tells you to put the fence up, your exposure area is well inside of that fence. So people on the outside are very, very safe. Now, again, we'll go back to anecdotals. I've had people put up 3-foot fences and think that was okay. If you can step over it, it is not okay.
Something I remember when these rules were first being implemented, and had a lot of discussions with Richard Tell, who was at EPA then. And there were things about measuring wrist currents and ankle currents when people were on hot towers, and the heating of the wrist and the ankle. And I guess at this point, basically, stay off of AM towers, right?
Pretty much. I mean, you might be okay on a 1 kilowatt tower for a short period of time if you're wearing an RF suit. But generally stay off of hot towers. It's a it's a really bad idea. Because as you climb up a tower, there are different points at which the tower is hotter and colder in terms of RF standard, and that has everything to do with a standing wave. Thank you, Barry. Barry is showing us some signs, and well, it's difficult to read them, but basically every sign has a word, warning, or caution, or notice, or in the case of red, more danger signs, and it goes on to delineate what the problem is and what mitigation you should do immediately at that site for that problem.
David, go ahead. If you're not done, David, go ahead.
No, I say most signs also nowadays include a reference to the FCC section 1.1301, just to say where they get their authority from.
Okay. We had another question come in that perhaps you would like to address. Has to do with a shared site. And the person says that one of the sites where we lease tower space, I noticed the word warning in red paint had completely faded away to nothing. The black parts say high voltage are okay, but the red part, red paint saying warning is totally gone, both on English and in Spanish.
Yep.
So the question basically comes down here. The tower registration numbers were also laying on the ground from broken tie wraps, which would, he says, brought dirty looks from the FCC.
Yes, it would.
But what about the legalities or liabilities with the warning sign?
Well, the FCC, in terms of their big thing, it deals with public exposure. So that's what they're really concerned about. Occupational exposure is much more the purview of the personnel working there and the owner of the site or the owner of the broadcast station. That deals more with your liability, my liability as a broadcaster if I let people onto the site. So generally, however, if I were doing an RF safety certification on a site and I saw signs that were unreadable or faded to unreadable or worse, trampled on the ground, I could not in good faith write a report that says you pass. Basically, signs have to perform their needed function, and they have to, because if they're not imparting useful information, they're a waste of everybody's time. They don't constitute part of the fence. They constitute part of the informational envelope for protection of people entering that area. And as far as the FCC, as far as signs go, don't use tie wraps. Don't use tie wraps. To get an old piece of Romex and hack off a 6-inch piece of soft copper wire and twist it on. It'll last longer, and if you have to move it, you can get it off.
There was a station some years ago that I was helping somebody with, and they had tied their STL dish and coax with tie wraps, which had broken.
Hmm.
They wondered why every afternoon they'd go off the air.
Yeah, that's a great example. I recently did a site, and literally every single sign on the site had faded to unreadable. Every single sign.
Do you sell signs, David, or do you point people to else places?
Not at this time. Right now, I point people towards Richard Tell and his son at RF Signs. I've toyed with the idea of getting into the sign business because frequently signs need information in a more specific form than is available on generically purchased signs. But I would say probably the best site I have seen for signs overall is Artel, Richard Tell RF Signs. I know Master Lock, believe it or not, produces some very good signs, especially as concerns electrocution risk. And, when you're dealing with an AM tower site, or perhaps a site where the power comes in and is attached to a transformer, and it's old, so the lugs are sitting right up in the air. Yeah, I mean, maybe that sign would be appropriate. But generally speaking, RF Signs does a good job. If I get into the business, I'll let you know.
All right. Anyone else would like to ask a question from David here?
You sent me a question that somebody had sent, and I'm trying to find it in an email here.
Any best practices for a station that has 100 watts at about 50 feet into a 2-bay?
Is that you, Ted? We could barely hear you.
Oh, sorry. Is this better?
Yes,
Let me adjust. How's that?
that's fine.
Better.
Oh, goodness. You'd think we'd know how to operate the volume control or the level control by now.
It's connected to a computer. That's our kids.
Yeah. Well, anyway, here we are. Best practices for an LPFM running 100 watts into a 2-bay NICOM at about 49 to 50 feet above ground.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
My first recommendation is strap climb preventers. If you don't have a fence around your tower, if you do, great. If you don't, unless the site is highly controlled and inaccessible, I would strap anti-climb panels onto that tower immediately.
There are anti-climb panels at the base of the tower, and they go up, I think, about 15 feet. I have
Usually
pictures.
10 or 15 feet, right. And the second thing is I would put on the each face of those panels signs saying, don't climb this tower, don't go anywhere near the antennas, because literally, if you get up to the antenna, having surveyed a number of sites like that and actually taken my probe up the tower and stuck it out in front of and beside the antenna, you can sit there and be over 100% of RFPG. Now, as an anecdote, one day I drove up the side of Packman-Adnock here in New Hampshire, and there was a guy sitting on the radome one of was a single bay radome FM station, and he's sitting on top of the radome. I think the power was 400 watts, single bay, but he's sitting on top of the radome eating his sandwich, enjoying the view. So, I basically engaged him in conversation and suggested he might come down and asked him if he'd ever had any children or intended to. And when he got down on the ground, when he was down close to me, I basically read him the riot act for his own good. And I kept saying, this is for your own good. And the only reason he climbed that tower was that the state of New Hampshire had put up a new fence and barbed wire around the fire tower that was across the parking lot. So he could no longer climb up to the level below the platform and sit there and look out. He couldn't do it. So he just found another location to have his sandwich at.
And it sounds like the 400 watt tower was not marked in any serious way, or no protection around it?
No, it had a fence. Well, this was my first time up there. It had a fence, but no barbed wire at the top of the fence. So the guy just went over the fence and up the tower.
Oh boy.
Now,
there we go.
Yeah, interestingly, I've recently come across several sites that have a new form of cyclone fence, where instead of being 2-inch blocks, they're 1-inch blocks. So it's the same general material. It looks like a cyclone fence, but you cannot climb it. It's almost impossible to climb.
Wow. Okay.
And so at new sites or at sites that are renovating, I would recommend that. It's quite a bit more expensive, but it is very exclusive in terms of keeping people off the site.
Metal fences are interesting because of contact current. I'd always thought wood fences were better.
Not so much a problem with FM, but definitely a problem with AM. Generally speaking, if you put a cyclone fence up around the base of an AM, you also have to bond it and tie it to the ground system.
This is the Richard Tell site, David, and it's interesting. Apparently there's some new Canadian regulations. So there's a Canadian sign there. There's something from AT&T and Verizon, which is interesting.
Yeah, they manufacture the signs for AT&T and Verizon. Yeah, I haven't, my friend Maxon has talked to the Tell family a lot because being involved with IEEE, he's also trying to wander through this whole ham regulation thing so that the guidance that is provided is clear and concise and usable. And again, I go back to OET 65. If you read it and then reread it and think about the intent and try to implement things without offense, try to implement security or prevention of electrocution or prevention of RF exposure, and you don't have offense, how are you going to do that? So it became kind of an obvious, okay, while they have no preference, ultimately the situation selects the preference in most cases of offense.
So in regard to the question I was asking, and thank you for your input, response, any concerns about RF exposure levels below the antenna if you're in a building?
Well, generally speaking, that's measurable, one,
Okay.
with an instrument. Two, in most cases, in the case of a 5-bay antenna, the antenna manufacturer has data that
Right.
that provides
This is two.
provides for the angles of declination and how many dB of suppression that those angles give you. So, like for instance, if you're under a I'm trying to think of the most egregious would be a single bay FM antenna where it goes down and up and out with equal power. And then you go to a 2-bay antenna at half wave space. It has less down production than it does at full wave space.
Right.
So all of those factors add in. I used to get a big kick out of people who would be very concerned about the cell tower. I've had women and men walk up to me at sites, doodling on their phone as they come, and say, "What are you doing?" And well, I'm, making measurements on radio frequency energy in the area, from that. Usually it's from that tower, and they go, "Oh," and of course, I don't want to freak them out by saying I'm measuring radiation, but so I usually use the word RF energy. But the point being is as soon as they begin to think about that tower, you can see the internal molecular change in them, and they go, "Oh my God!" And it's interesting at times to walk people back from that cliff and educate them about RF energy. And there's a good example of a climb tower right there.
Yeah.
David, question was posed here. Is 97 the most recent version of this document, the OET 65?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that with absolute surety. I believe it is, but at this moment, I'd have to look through my library to see what's labeled OET 65 and 97 that's not. So I honestly cannot answer that question.
The questioner says, seems like all of our FCC inspection and safety guidelines are somewhat agent.
That is a true statement. Right there is a true statement. But I cannot answer with 100% certainty that there hasn't been any modification to OET 65.
Thank you.
I have some notes here saying that it was being revised in 2021.
Yes. Yes, it was being revised in 2021. And about the only part that has been made public so far is the section on ham radio. And in that case, basically they told all the hams, we want you to come into compliance with OET 65. You are going to self-certify and you have 2 years to do it.
Mr. Bialik wants to comment on the RF energy at the top of the Empire State Building or the former World Trade Center.
Yeah, I have friends who've worked on both sites. In fact, there's a picture somewhere, and I don't have it handy today, of the two partners of Broadcast Signal Lab from almost 40 years ago, hanging out of the access door on the Empire State Building in their blue suits. So their blue RF suits. So what's the question?
Well, the RF energy in the transmitter rooms.
Oh, in the transmitter rooms, it's usually very tightly controlled and very easily controlled, because you think you have metal boxes that are designed not to, basically they're designed not to kill the people who work around them.
We hope.
Putting it plainly. So you have metal boxes feeding metal coaxial cables where the inside is hot and the outside is ground. And again, they're designed to contain the energy and convect the energy. In the case of waveguides, same thing. The inside of the waveguide is hot and the outside of the waveguide is not. And the energy gets conducted to the antenna. Generally speaking, at those sites, whether you're talking about through combiners or through filters, or I've surveyed multiple sites with multiple transmitters going on at the same time. Generally speaking, their design, the design is so tight that you'd be lucky to get 2 to 3 to 4% of the RFPG. while walking around inside that building. The sole exception on that seems to be above and below coaxial switches. For some reason, coaxial switches, even with a metal cover, are leakier. And they may be 15 or 20% of RFPG, or just under 20%, right up within 8 inches of the, or at 8 inches from the can. But again, double the distance, half the power. The can's 12 feet in the air, hanging from a catwalk galley. You're walking around underneath it, 7 feet below it, your head's 7 feet below the can. You'd be lucky to get 3%.
I think it's interesting on the coaxial switches. These are also places where your return loss takes a beating. If
Mhm.
you're measuring out a system, I think the thing with coax switch is it's the right angles. It's the RF changing direction several times.
Yeah.
Like say your return loss may be 40 dB in the system. You put this in, or a patch panel will do this.
Mhm.
Suddenly you're in the 20s. And they also tend to be the things that have the warm spots on them.
Yep. And generally speaking, the only way inside of a transmitter plant generally that you wind up taking an RF bath or having the RF levels increase is if something is broken or damaged, or malfunctioning. Gone are the days, for the most part, mercifully, when people would mount open ATUs on the wall of a transmitter building, or open rocker switches to swap between towers or patterns. It still does occur, but it is getting rarer. And a lot of broadcasters on their own would rather put something in a box that has a bonded hinge and is grounded than have it hanging out in the middle of the room. And the other advantage to putting things in a box is you don't get dust on them. If there's no air infiltration, the physical damage that can occur doesn't.
And there aren't very many more glass front transmitters like you see behind me here.
Yes, like old Continentals and Collins.
Yep, that's
Oh,
exactly what it is. This is
well-
actually the 10 kilowatt section. I couldn't find the 50.
That's very nice, Bo. I like the background.
I have to wonder what sort of RF energy some of the jocks in the 60s may have experienced from 5 kilowatt AM transmitters that were on the other side of a glass hallway, because they had to be able to see in order to control without having to go to the remote control rules and all.
Having run into a number of those older transmitters while they were still online, and this because my career goes back almost 4 decades in this field, having run into a number of those, I can honestly say that with the exception of right up close to the sight glass, most of them were very cold. I mean, very, 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 very user friendly. The biggest problem was a lot of people used to like to go and put their nose right on the glass to look at the tubes. Ooh, isn't that glow neat? No, don't do that.
David, a question was raised about personal RF monitors. The ones tower crews have, or others that could be purchased. Would you
Yep.
recommend them or talk about them?
Yeah, NARDA makes a very, very good, very usable system. They still calibrate them.
Cost? Cost?
Cost for a NARDA unit, personal NARDA unit monitor, I think it's around $2,000. There are a number of let's say Amazon buys that will give you a reasonably accurate indication as a personal monitor. Most of them tend to err on the side of they go off well before you're at 100%. But again, you're dealing with something that was manufactured on the cheap and sold on the cheap, and
How did those things do in terms of appropriate frequency correction?
Some of them have frequency correction and some of them don't. Just it's a fact. Some of them do, some of them don't. You really have to read the literature, and at the end of the day, at least currently, I think you're still whistling past the graveyard a little. You know, I absolutely can't say no because I've seen them in operation. I have one myself that I sort of take along just as a joke. Let's see how
So
this is. How
Are
this
these,
is against this.
are these basically like diode detectors with networks on them? Or does anybody doing anything with a bag of salt water and a thermometer?
No, nobody's doing that I know of. But anecdotally, if you take a NARDA piece of equipment and go near an AM site and hold it in your hand, it'll go off way sooner than 100% than where the instrument would find 100%, because your body acts as a collector and a re-radiator of that energy at AM frequencies.
Question for the group, going back to the ATUs that are in the open.
Yes.
Am I still on?
Yes, John, you are, but just before we do that, the question was raised about the, David, I'm sorry, the Field Sense RF monitor in competition with the NARDA.
Oh, manufacturer, Field Sense?
Yes.
Haven't used it, haven't looked into it.
Okay.
I've used Halliday's and I've used NARDA's.
John, go ahead. Mr. Mackey?
He's still on mute.
Question for the group. Am I getting through?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay, here's my question. Going backwards a little bit in our discussion, there was they were talking about the older style ATU and switches that were in the open, not in any kind of a box at some of your older AM sites. So how much should we be concerned about those old 1 kW, about that type of gear still operational in the open with no shielding, no box, anything at an old 1 kW site?
Okay, well, generally speaking, an open ATU, well, first of all, if an open ATU, any energy fields that develop around the coils or the connectors is available. It moves in all directions. Generally, it doesn't move through the plate that it's mounted on behind it. But I've seen ATUs actually built on wood with ceramic standoffs. In that case, at a kilowatt, you probably shouldn't stand anywhere closer than 3 feet to any part of it. Okay. And of course, if you're end onto a coil, that's going to produce a higher field than if you're perpendicular to its axis. You're standing, end on is probably the most dangerous, if you will, orientation. And again, now we're going to get into another category where we start averaging whole body average. Even with whole body average, to try to, if any part of your body exceeds 100%, you should not be standing there. Any part of the 6 vertical feet that occupy your human being, you should not be standing there. And generally speaking, at 1 kilowatt, the distance back from certain hot elements, because coils develop a different corona, if you will, of RF than the feed loop outside the ATU on the way to the tower, then does the lightning arrestor or the steel of the tower. They all develop a slightly different way of spreading RF at short distances where you would be concerned. So in generally 3 feet from that, and as you go up in power, the number goes up. If I were to have to say exactly the exact distance depends upon the coil or the elements that you're standing in front of. And it can be as short as 8 or 10 inches and as far away as 3 feet.
Sounds like a good
comment.
job for a meter.
Yeah, a comment, when we did the 1110 site out at Irwindale, we evaluated the ATUs inside the boxes and put a chain at the limit point at each ATU. And the tower powers, of course, varied from a high of 30 kilowatts to a low of less than 1,000 watts. So the chain distance was different between each tower, but it showed clearly where the danger limit was.
Yep.
As long as you're evaluating a site, do that.
Were those metal chains?
I think they were. We hung a sign on them, a warning sign on them.
Yeah.
But they weren't hot. I mean, I touched them many times. They weren't hot.
I've been on rooftop sites where they use plastic chain, heavy duty plastic chain, and they hang it between pylons, and that's the delineation. You can't go any closer than that.
Yeah, I really like non-conductive stuff around AM towers. Getting back, hopefully not too far from broadcast, on the amateur radio side, has anybody done anything about signage requirements?
Okay, well, that gets into the whole gray area of whether or not hams are going to be required to look like commercial broadcasters or commercial emitters. I think to some degree, best practice, they're going to have to. But again, if you're a ham operator, your gear, if it's in your own property, sometimes it's in your own house, and you control access to your house. So that may cover you on that score. And signage,
Yeah, especially
sounds
about
like-
the antenna, which is outdoors.
Yeah.
And it does seem like the FCC, they removed the exemption for amateur, and they're tending to make them say, you have to do the same thing as everybody else.
that is true. Yeah, on that score. Well, see, that's where the discussion going on right now between hams and the ARRL and the FCC will come to play. There have been much comment going back and forth about, does that mean I have to put up a fence? And in general, depending upon the antenna, the answer would probably be no, because a long wire strung 12 feet up in a tree, if you know it's not producing a field over the public limit at ground level, you might have to put a sign on the tree, don't climb this tree. I find it unlikely that the FCC will require fences and locks and keys around ham sites. In part because most hams you don't put your antenna on the ground,
Yeah, except for verticals.
Yes, well, there you go.
Sounds like a can of worms to me, but
It is, and I think the two components are, you have to be aware, right now, the two components that are hard and fast is you have to be aware of what your site is doing. And that goes back to that calculator. And barring that, you buy an RF meter and assess your site that way, but you are essentially at this point required to self-certify that you're aware and you're protecting.
I actually did that previously. Prior to the fancy web calculator, somebody had published a MS-DOS calculator, which I've looked like it produces exactly the same result. Not as pretty as the web, but it does do the job.
So I'm thinking of surrounding a vertical antenna with cacti to keep people away from it.
Well, You said cat, what?
Cactuses, cacti?
Cacti. Well, that would work.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in Arizona.
Oh, cacti. I was going, what? Catgut? What? Interestingly, there is a couple sites that I know of ham operators that are using orange cyclone fence. They just put up a few stakes, wooden stakes, and wrapped it in orange cyclone fence.
Well, David, we've held you here for an hour and a half now, and I think that we may need to let you go.
Thank you for that, for putting that up.
We certainly want to invite people to give you a call for anything from consulting to having you come out and make a measurement. Phone number is there. The email address is it's right there on your
Well, it's just below the screen.
your box. And,
DPBD at Verizon DPBD at broadcastsignallab.com.
right.
And I do travel. So if a broadcaster is in New England, or thereabouts, probably anywhere out to Ohio, I might be willing to travel. Interestingly, I saved a broadcaster up on the Canadian border a fortune, because he absolutely thought he had to have me come up and assess his site. And I said, let's start out with pictures and labels and figure out where everything is. And even though he was on an FM tower, he was in his own compound. He was an LPTV, excuse me, memory. He was an PTV. He was in his own compound, separate from the city compound or town compound that was just down the hill. And he was able to use the calculator to certify to the FCC for license renewal. And I would have had to drive 2 puddle jumpers and a rented car to get to the town they were at, out in the middle of nowhere, up on the edge of the Canadian border. And he was very happy that he didn't have to pay that. So
Okay.
anyway, so we really do make an effort to keep people safe and to help them be safe.
Well, we appreciate that. We really appreciate you coming on with us today and sharing your wisdom and experience, and we'll invite you back again another time for some more information.
I appreciate it. And I hope next time I'll be able to share at a drop of a hat and be a little bit smoother on presentation. This is a first time I've presented probably in about 4 years. So thank you.
Glad to
very
have
much
you.
for the opportunity.
You did fine.
Thank you.